So hi everyone, my name is Karen, and thank you to Moov for putting on this wonderful conference. It's been wonderful just the last day or so talking to people and hearing all of your questions and thoughts. So I've actually incorporated some of those thoughts into this presentation. So thank you to all of you that I've spoken to before this session. And if you want to talk afterwards, I'm free anytime. So we'll be talking about securing financial and Web3 mobile apps and the best practices that I've seen. So my background is over 25 years in tech and working mostly with financial services companies. I started working with financial standards organizations like SWIFT and Accord to establish communication standards for trading, banking, and so forth. And then went into a blockchain company, BlockCypher, that was the first to provide APIs that go across multiple blockchains. And so we were chatting earlier about how there were lots of innovations in that space, some of which were not financial, but we can go into that. Seed to Weed was one application that was really funny. But yes, spent a lot of time with financial organizations doing different types of proof of concepts, identity-related proof of concepts as well. And then because I saw, like many of you probably have seen, the wild, wild west nature of crypto, wanted to do my part to prevent fraud. And so I started a company called Blockchain Intel to identify fraud on blockchains, blockchain transactions, and also blockchain-related transactions to ACH and credit card transactions. So one of our first customers was eToro, an exchange, and we helped them through our risk scoring API identify the highest risk transactions, and if it was high enough risk, then they would block that transaction from coming in. We also worked with credit card companies who were using crypto as rewards, and so found early on the different fraud techniques that fraudsters use on credit cards early on with blockchain, with crypto. And then because of, as you guys probably know, of the irreversibility nature of crypto, I began to focus much more on fraud prevention, and that's why we became part of Appdome, where for the last 4.5 years, I've been working with the largest fintechs and financial banks and organizations to prevent fraud in mobile apps. And so helping them safely and securely process trillions of dollars of payments. And on the side, I've kept up my nonprofit, Blockchain by Women, which provides consulting services to victims of fraud in the crypto space, so have seen firsthand, unfortunately, the continued scams and work in that area, but I help them write reports and work with the FBI and other law enforcement to get their money back. And I also have another nonprofit that I started years ago when I was in school, and it's focused on entrepreneurship. But I just thought this fintech audience would be interested to know that we have this challenge, this business plan competition, and every year we have a huge section that grows just for fintech apps, and happy to talk about that if you're interested too. So the focus of my discussion and my sort of lens is today going to be around mobile is one big area, and then Web3 is another, but still around mobile apps. And you guys have probably seen already, most people spend their time on mobile versus the internet. And what that means, though, for companies is two things. One is those consumers that see their apps are being protected, their data is being protected, will vouch, will promote the company that's producing that app. And this is based on studies that we at Appdome have done every year of global consumers around the world. And 93% say that if the app is protecting them and their data, they will write recommendations, reviews, positive reviews. And on the other hand, if the app isn't protecting them, then the 73% say they will churn, they will leave if there's an exploit. And this is, I just bring this up here because more and more I see, the number's even bigger now, say they rely on the mobile bank as their bank. Probably many of you know younger people, certainly my kids are in that category, and they will never go into a branch. They will never, if they can, have to talk to somebody. To get something done, they prefer to use a mobile app. And if there is an app for that, then what's the point of that? One of the questions that came up yesterday was, how are mobile apps different than web, and is web different? And I'm saying yes, there are a number of differences, and there are reasons why people will want to use mobile apps as opposed to even a browser in a mobile app. And one of unfortunately, another case that I have come across is a person who was using an app that he was using the application through a browser, a web browser, not a mobile app, and his private keys were stolen, were compromised. And aside from that use case, here are a number of areas, or reasons why people will use mobile apps or opt for mobile apps. One is in terms of local data protection. The mobile app allows you to have hardware-backed. You have solutions like a keychain, key store, whereas a browser is focused on cookies, local storage only. In terms of network security, mobile apps can provide certificate pinning. So this allows the app to verify that the server they are communicating with is the server they should be communicating with, and the server can verify the app is the app that they should be communicating with. So that adds that extra level of verification of the connection. And then in terms, whereas browsers have HTTPS only. In terms of code protection, many mobile apps, at least this is the recommendation, this is the best practice, should have code obfuscation, anti-tampering, some way of protecting the code so when you open it up and look at it with any kind of tool, you cannot see everything about the libraries where the sensitive data is and so forth. In terms of web threats, browsers have cross-site scripting attacks, and that's where scripts get injected into the website that are harmful, malicious. But you can't do that with web apps. And then in terms of runtime threats, this is a very big part of many mobile app security solutions is to protect the app at runtime from attacks coming in. A lot of the focus that I've seen in the last few years has been on shifting left, so making sure that you're in the coding process, you're having the best coding practices, and that's all important, that's good, but the reality is with AI and all these attacks that are faster to create now, there are more runtime attacks, and the apps and basically everything are vulnerable to these runtime attacks. So even if you are coding something and using safe practices there, that's not necessarily going to protect you from all of the runtime threats and attacks, and we'll go through some of those. So the costs are high. You are probably familiar with many of these. I'll just highlight a few. So ransom payments have gone up. Palo Alto Networks puts out a report of that increase every year. In terms of data breaches in the financial sector, if you're not aware, Ponemon Institute and IBM together put a report every year, and that number also goes up. Specific to the financial sector, the average cost of a breach is $6 million. And those include costs like legal and regulatory penalties. So Morgan Stanley faced a $35 million fine for the SEC for data protection failures. There's reputational damage. So like the report I talked about earlier, Ponemon Institute has another report which says 65% of consumers would change providers after a data breach. And then here are a couple of examples of apps that have been compromised and the millions that they have lost to either repay back the users that have lost their money or deal with the remediation and other legal costs. So what's happening and why are these attacks happening more? Well, AI, as we've all talked about probably for a long time now, has changed the game so that it's easier to create more sophisticated attacks faster. So what we used to see a few years ago in the hacker community where they would take exploits and hackers would create them and then sell them on the dark market and buy other tools, right, and then build on each other, right? So that has changed now to, okay, they're all creating deep fakes, or they're now more likely to create deep fakes and scams. And that means more advanced social engineering attacks and account takeover. So we'll talk a little bit more about what these are. So some examples are biometric bypass. And how many of you are working with some kind of authentication or identity verification in the room? Okay, so you have probably seen this firsthand where just, I would say since last year, this has become a really big issue. So biometric bypass means people are substituting the actual camera on your phone with a virtual camera that the hacker controls. They're replacing images. They're the actual image of the person. Sorry, the image, if they have your phone, they've stolen your phone, let's say, they're replacing their image with your image. Or even if they're doing this remotely, they're replacing images. And they have tools to do this. There is voice cloning, if you're using voice as a way to do the biometric authentication. There's also liveness detection evasion. So I know Apple and Android have ways to see, okay, are you moving, going side to side, but they have ways to alter that, to spoof that. There's a lot of app cloning going on because it's easier to do that, where they are basically creating farms, device farms, or they have ways to clone the app so the apps can then capture, these fake apps, these clone apps can capture the OTP of a real person and then use that in the fake app to then, transfer funds. Or they'll have virtual environments that they are using to accept fake data, to create fake data. And then there are the digital injection attacks. So this is where people will, because they have all this information on the web, right? They can have all these pictures of you and me and our family and everybody, and they can take those and de-age the images. I heard this from one of the banks I was working with. They see a lot of de-aging of images, of driver's licenses to be submitted as new ones, because you have to, you can't be like, okay, this is the current picture, right, of this person. They got their driver's license 5 years ago or whatever, so they de-age them and they use them to try to get past KYC. Then there are videos. There's so many videos that can be created of people to bypass different checks. So where is this becoming a problem? Different banks around the world have been tracking this. So deep fakes have happened at one bank over thousands of times. And that's estimated to be a cost of over $100 million for them. I don't know if you guys heard of the deepfake video last year in Hong Kong, where the CFO thought he was talking to the CEO, but was not. And that led to a $25 million threat. And you kind of hear of these things, unfortunately, every so often, many of which isn't published, but is happening. And I hear a lot of stories, and I don't know if you have, of vishing attacks. So when people are using the mobile phone, and this unfortunately happens to a lot of older people. So if you have any parents, like I told my parents, if I ever call you and it looks like me on a video call and I ask you for money, 2FA it. Like, find another way to call me back and make sure and confirm that it's not me. Because I've heard so many stories of people being called and elderly parents, or older, sorry, elderly, parents being called by their kids supposedly asking for money, and the voice sounds the same, the face looks the same, everything looks the same, saying, I've been injured, I've been hurt, or I'm caught someplace and I need help, and then, asking for funds to be delivered to them. So this is often attack in mobile that it happens when you can detect when the app is open and the call is coming in. So anyway, I'll go into some of that in more detail about how you can fight it, but there are ways to fight vishing, but it is a very common thing, unfortunately, that I've heard more often than I'd like recently. But this problem is, these identity-related problems have been happening at such a rate. Biometric bypass has been such a big problem that Gartner believes that by next year, 30% of enterprises will abandon facial recognition as the only, or facial biometrics as the only way of authenticating. So we were talking earlier, authentication is not going away, it's very important, but it needs to be used in combination with other things because these AI attacks are just totally changing the game. And so you have to fight AI with AI. And so there are a lot of tools right now, the good thing, and it's a bit of an arms race or, a race in general to keep up with these guys. But there are tools, the good thing is there are tools, as we were speaking last night about solutions. And so the good thing is there are ways to detect when the deepfake bypass is occurring. So the hackers will put apps, like deepfake apps, they'll install them on the device, so you can identify those. They will try to replace, substitute the cameras, right? They'll try to intercept the process, and so you can detect when that interception is happening and then stop it, right? And you can stop it in a way that doesn't ruin the user experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to go through some of these detections first so that we can build up to that. So one of the questions that came up in our discussions is iOS is so protected, right? Like if I have an app that goes into the Apple Store, it's going to be totally safe. And while you can say in the grand scheme of things, Android is more open than Apple, and so there are more attacks on Android apps. There still are, unfortunately, attacks on iOS apps, and iOS apps are vulnerable to the point where I've talked to companies about having to comply with new regulation in the UK and Europe about protecting against hooking frameworks. And so with iOS apps, we see this as well as with Android iOS, but definitely with iOS apps, hooking frameworks are used. And so hooking frameworks are methods and tools that hackers will use to instrument the app or basically go in and try to change the behavior of the app. And this is a problem because that means they can go in and make fake clicks, they can make fake keystrokes, they can do keystroke injection, basically do things that the end user did not want to do. Also with iOS apps as well as with Android apps, we see a lot of use of keyloggers. So phishing becomes more sophisticated and easier, phishing, smishing, phishing, all that becomes easier because the hackers know more about you. So they can more easily target you. Well, how do they get this information? Well, they are using tools like keylogging, spyware, to capture that information. They're also using on-device malware that can take over the user's transaction. So it's not just when you log in, right? It's actually when you're doing the transaction that if there's malware on the device, it can take over that transaction. And so in financial services, there are a number of different banking Trojans that are out there that keep evolving and changing so that when there is a way to block one banking Trojan, well, don't worry, there is another one that comes up and another one, right? So you have to constantly keep up with these new types of malware. And then like we were talking about before, there are, I see a lot of use of fake devices. There are device farms, and these different device farms are being used to launch more automated attacks, so credential stuffing attacks, more often faster on a broader scale, and also launch location fraud, various location fraud attacks. So like we were talking about, when do these attacks happen? When I talk to a lot of companies, they're saying, well, traditionally the thinking was that a lot of the attacks happened when the app was launched. So that's why, the focus was around authentication. And if we have authentication, then that's all we need, right? But that's not the case anymore because the AI and the attackers are now able to basically go after every single part. And so I'll just go through some examples. So with the launch, at launch, there are authentication bypass techniques that are used, like we talked about. There is oftentimes like the authentication fatigue. So, the one-time password can be intercepted. There's credential replay. During registration, fake accounts can be easily created. So I'll show you an example of that. Mule accounts can be created. We've even seen or heard of people being shipped phones, free phones. And the free phones have apps on them, and people use those apps. And okay, so that's also another problem. But then in every part of the cycle here, right, whether it's purchasing, so replay, token attacks, and emulators being used in pay-in, account takeovers, payment rerouting, any kind of man in the middle, so basically any interception between the app and the end server. There's logic tampering, token abuse, and even when you are trying to do something like do a password reset, there could be interception at that point. The malware could come in and intercept that. And if someone's checking their balance, that balance could be manipulated because the memory could be manipulated in the app. And in every part of the cycle, there could be different types of overlay attacks where screens are put over the credentials so that when the user is entering their information in, they can't see this invisible screen that the hacker has put there, but that screen is being used to capture their credentials and then sent back to the hacker. So let me go into fake accounts because this is a case that are a problem that I have seen more often recently. And so what the hackers or fraudsters will do is create these bots, and these bots create these headers where the information, like one part of the information in this header is spoofed. So the device ID, right, is being spoofed. And then that bot sends out a fake payload, and it sends out this fake username and password, but the tools that the company is using can't tell that these emails are fake. And then the fraudster is able to use the referral code to trigger promotions for themselves. And so in one case of a payment company, they've been able to create cards loaded with money that then the fraudsters use to sell in the dark market. So why is this happening? Well, the challenge is existing solutions, first of all, aren't able to identify when these bots are doing these things, right? Some of these solutions that companies are using are really focused on just the user behavior or just the email and phone, and that can be easily spoofed, more easily spoofed these days. If they're using CAPTCHA, they can be bypassed using automation. If they're using a WAF, a lot of organizations will say, well, I have a web application firewall, so that's going to block out all the bad stuff. Well, unfortunately, they don't. These web application firewalls have the word web in them, so they were designed for the web. They weren't designed for mobile. So they don't have the mobile telemetry data. They don't have the mobile-specific rules to block out mobile bots. And on top of that, some of these mobile SDKs only work with one vendor, and they don't work across all apps, and it's more challenging to work with. And then I've spoken to companies who have fingerprinting SDKs, and that's important, but these fingerprinting SDKs are more limited, and we'll go into specifically why in a little bit. But one of the limitations is they could be fooled or they could be used on rooted devices. And the result of these issues is a number of things, right? So one is you may have concurrency conflicts. You may, as companies try to pull together a lot of solutions really quickly, you may end up with concurrency conflicts, security policy conflicts, increased debugging complexity. And what I've just found as a result, since the beginning of this year, after looking at a lot of Google Play and Apple Store reviews, is end users complaining about logging in, having a hard time getting past, the login, or being asked to re-authenticate when they are in fact real users, but they're getting identified as fake or bad actors. And that causes them to write these bad reviews, which causes the company to lose reputation, causes people to churn, because they will often say, well, I've stopped using the app entirely. And then, that leads to lost revenue. So, so those are the, I'm just going to summarize the big problems with wallet apps. Now, I'm going to switch, mobile apps in wallets in general. I'm going to switch a little bit to crypto and crypto apps or Web3 apps, just because there are some unique characteristics of Web3 apps that are important to go through. Now, in general, there are a lot of different blockchain attacks. And so I know yesterday we were speaking to some of you about different smart contract attacks. So you guys have probably heard of, I don't know if you've heard of cross-chain bridge attacks and so that's one big problem. When I started in crypto about 10 years ago, they were talking a lot about how we have to fix the double spend issue, and that was something that was talked about a lot, as well as mining pool attacks, blockchain network attacks, and then of course there will always be user wallet attacks, because if the blockchain is secure and that's all great, the problem is the weak point may be the connection with the end user, right? Because you are your own bank, and if you don't have a wallet that helps you secure your private key, or you don't know how to use a secure private key, or you get phished or whatever, then bad things happen. And so out of all the billions that have been lost in 2025, what I have found is that most of the funds have been lost to two areas. One is wallet attacks, and the other is scams. So in terms of wallet attacks, what's been happening is, yes, there's private key hacks, so people come in and swipe your private key or figure out how to get your private key, or they use phishing to steal your keys, and then there have been a lot of scams. And one of the cases I worked on was a person who was called by Google support, and Google support said, hey, you've got a problem, let me help you. Got into his email, looked through his email, saw he had a particular wallet that he was using. Then they called in as that wallet tech support, saying, oh, you have a problem with your wallet. And he just didn't know, and unfortunately gave them, in the end, his keys, and they were able to take his funds away. DeFi scams are ones where they'll target certain people who don't maybe know how well the markets work, and so they're promised things, a lot of things, or they obscure issues. So there are a lot of DeFi scams that I've seen recently, and the websites are problematic, and then again, the funds are put someplace where the user doesn't know how to get access to them. But my point in bringing up this latter section here of scams is that, going back to our earlier point, people know more, the hackers and fraudsters know more about us, right? So yes, there are the attacks, like I'm sure everybody in here has gotten a Coinbase email, or I know a lot of people don't even have Coinbase accounts to get Coinbase emails, so they're just doing brute force, fine. That's one way. But then they are also collecting information using the different tools that we talked about, keylogging, malware, other things, to get information about you, to steal those credentials, that information, to then do even more targeted phishing, and then leading to more secrets being revealed and funds stolen. So this is just sort of an overview of the attacks and scams. Now, the existing solutions that are out there in the crypto space are limited, right? So yes, there are a lot of crypto solutions out there. Most of them really are focused on tracing and following the funds. I know this because I started a company to do this, and that's what I did. But the problem is, when you find where the funds go, they don't go to a place that the law enforcement can go, right? So I'll give you an example. So I was helping, we were helping people who had gotten their Dash, stolen Dash is one of the type of crypto. It was converted into different coins, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ether, and Bitcoin Cash. And it was sent to different exchange brokers, and we were able to trace it ultimately to an exchange, and then subpoenaed the exchange, and then got to the bank where the funds from the exchange were deposited. Now, the problem is the US didn't have official relationships in that country. And so no matter how much proof we had, we couldn't get those funds back. And unfortunately, the hackers know how to do that, right? They know how to move their money out to a place where the US does not have jurisdiction. And it's just heartbreaking for the people who lose their funds. Now, the other thing the hackers do is they will put the funds through mixers. So as soon as they steal the funds, they put it in a mixer. And so a mixer will take legitimate transactions with the stolen fund transactions and mix them all up. So you can't tell who went where, basically. And so this is like a graph of that. So let's say you have one transaction here where the funds were put, then through the mixer, the funds get split up into all these tiny little transactions and go into all these other different wallets, and it's really hard to trace them afterwards. And there are also other different types of things, techniques they do, like besides sending through mixers. But there's basically a number of things that make it challenging, even if you are able to trace the funds, to get the funds back. And then there are also challenges in tracing the funds themselves. So what I found, and this is sort of a summary of the solution types, and this is just based on my experience, so take it as you will, and happy to discuss it later. This isn't based on any one company. So what I found is just really important is to have, number one, a way of tracking the signals from both users, end users, so their fingerprint, the user behavior, user transaction. So that's one way of fingerprinting. But the other way of fingerprinting is really looking at the fraudsters and the tools and the methods that they're using. And then combine that sort of detection approach with active defense. Because if you can detect, but you don't have an active defense, then and the active defense is right away, is immediate. And before the funds are moved, then it doesn't matter, because once the funds are moved, the damage has been done. And as a backdrop, I know how many of you have talked about or are working on passive and active fingerprinting solutions? Okay, so you guys are aware. So I'll just go over this at a very high level. So these are the different types of fingerprinting that complement authentication. So passive is where you're collecting information without requiring some interaction from the user. The good thing is it's visible to the user, it's low friction, it's mainly for fraud detection, bot mitigation, so forth. Active fingerprinting is where you're actively probing the device, so you're running scripts or you're doing some tests like CAPTCHA, but the challenge is it may affect the user experience. The good thing is it does have higher accuracy, is often used for things like emulator detection and other things. Emulator detection, app integrity checks, and so forth. So going back to the user fingerprinting versus the fraudster fingerprinting. In terms of the user fingerprinting, what's out there is looking at the device ID, the IP, the email, phone, all kind of behavioral signals, and that's often shared. A lot of solutions out there will have this shared intelligence and do link analysis across billions of different transactions. Companies will also do mouse and keystroke analysis, so they're tracking your scrolling speed, your typing cadence, and so forth. So basically building a profile of you, of users. And then they'll also track the app usage and use an accelerometer, basically to do continuous behavioral authentication, because it's, like we talked about earlier, it's just not just at authentication. It's not just when you first launch the app. You need to continuously be checking that this person is the person that should be using the app, and it's not a stolen device or other things or been compromised. Now, overall, the gaps with these solutions is that you can't detect bots. So like we talked about earlier, if the bot changes the headers, okay, these solutions don't generally, or at least today, don't catch that. They don't catch on-device tampering, reverse engineering. There are, unfortunately, a number of fake account false positives, and this creates a lot of problems for the company because you have poor user experience on the one hand, because people are misidentified as being bad actors, and then you also are wasting the time of the engineers who have to go back and remediate and figure out what the problem is and see, are these really fake accounts or not, and figure out the best solution. Another challenge is you can't detect the hackers or the fraudsters, so you're not capturing things like overlay attacks, malware. And then another issue that we've seen is that you can't identify fraud from shared or borrowed devices. So like I'm here in Colorado, but I'm from California, and let's say I am using an app I'm using a computer from this event, right? And they can't tell, who it is that I am the same person. And then when we look at the fraudster signals, okay, the fraudster tools will focus on the device integrity, app tampering, really looking at what the fraudster is doing. Like, is the fraudster trying to commit accessibility abuse? So this is where the fraudster is getting in and elevating privileges for themselves, or they're using tools like ADB at runtime. Like everybody will, not everybody, but developers will use Android Debug Bridge for legitimate reasons. But if it's being used at runtime in situations where it's probably not for good reasons, then you should catch that and stop it. And so there are platforms that detect these threats and defenses that's integrated into the CI/CD. So from a development perspective, it's automated. So you don't have to code this in. You don't have to use an SDK. There are other SDK-based solutions, but there are other solutions that make it part of an automated build process. So the other thing that tracking, in terms of tracking fraudster behavior is important is looking at malware signatures, root detection. So if someone is trying to root the device or they're trying to jailbreak, bypass, you want to catch that because that's usually an indication of something bad going on. And so you're looking at tools that use on-device machine learning to detect these threats in real time. And then finally, it's always important to look at operating system vulnerabilities, look at any kind of do static and dynamic analysis to identify code risks. And overall, in terms of the gaps, right, these solutions, because they're focused on the fraudster, they don't do the link analysis, the account link analysis. Some of the solutions that are SDK-based, and this I talked to someone else yesterday about this. Some of the solutions that are SDK-based are more difficult to integrate. They, are just harder to deal with. They have their own cycles. They're released. If the SDK is released, there's an update. Then you have to update your app. And then if you're only doing security testing, so how many of you use like a security testing solution? Okay, so there are some companies that will use either a pen tester or they have a security scanning solution. And that's good, but that requires the developer to go back and make the changes. And that is a problem sometimes for organizations because they have to be able to build that time in. And if the list is too long, then it becomes a problem. What I found is just with the existing solutions out there, especially with the fingerprinting, right? All solutions have some kind of device in session fingerprinting. So that's, the passive solutions, the traditional fraud detection solutions and so forth. But not all have a way of binding the user identity to the specific app release and device state. And so we were talking about earlier agentic, the agents being used to do transactions, to do things on your behalf. Well, how do you know you've got a legitimate agent? So I think there is a need to go in this direction, right? You have to truly identify that a user is the user that should be, like if we would just say the person, to identify the user should be using the app legitimately, there needs to be a way to tie that person to the app release and the device state and other aspects. And you also still need to have the biometric analysis that we talked about, the device linking analysis. All of that is still important. So depending on where you are, so you can use this kind of like as an audit of your solutions today. What do you have? What don't you have? What's important to you? And then fill in, the gaps there. But overall, what I see is the need to not only capture all those signals, so capture the end user signals, capture the fraudster signals, passive and active, but to be able to enforce actively. So this last piece I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on is enforce actively in a way that does not diminish the user experience, that only enhances the user experience. Because for fintechs, for all of us, we know this is our bread and butter, right? The user experience is king. This is why people also use mobile apps, because the user experience is so much stickier. But if you have a bad experience, if the user doesn't know how to get back to using the app, then that's bad for the user, you, and the company. So what I mean by this is having a way to end the session if necessary, let the user know what's going on, and then allow them to get back to using the app. So here are a couple of examples. So one of the best practices that I found is being able to enable you as developers, as user developers, have a way to customize the user experience based on the type of attack. So there are ways to create like a security notification to say to the user, hey, this malware has been happening. Maybe you don't want to say exactly which malware, but something has happened, and to protect you, the app will close. Now call this 1-800 number, use this code, and then the customer support will be able to help you, right? So that's kind of the most basic thing to do, is to just provide a notification when the event happens, letting them know the event happened, and then what to do next. The other approach is to say, okay, we're running this simulation, and because we ran the simulation, we found you are susceptible to this, say, specific biometric attack or whatever attack. Now, to get extra protection, you can enroll in this program. So this is kind of a way of saying, hey, if this is an upsell program, right? If you want the extra protection, opt in. By the way, you are more vulnerable. So if you want to opt in, this is the way to do it. But my point is, depending on the situation, depending on what's happening to the user themselves, you within the app should be able to control that user experience, so they don't just get oh, my app crashed, this sucks, the app is not working, and I don't know what to do next, right? So you want to have that controlled user experience. And then the last thing is being able to do this in an end-to-end way. And so all these different things I'm showing you may be different products. At this conference with Moov and fintechs in general, we're all sort of, I think someone said last night, we're all competitive but collaborative. And so using these services together is really important, but having a way of being able to code but build in an automated way the protections in, because there's so many protections that are required. There's so many attacks that are going on, and it's really important to work together so that if you're focused on building the app, let someone else do the protections. And yes, you need to know what those protections are, and you got to pick those protections, but you can let them do that or detect that. Have a way of controlling that user experience when those detections or protections come in play. And then when the app is released, have a way of continuously tracking the live attacks, because there will always be new ones. So how do you track and defend against the new attacks? And then finally, have an automated way of remediation. So being able to have sort of this like self-help portal, whatever, end user self-remediation. And there are a lot of different tools for that are being developed, again, yeah, AI-based, that make that easier. So I know there are a lot of solutions out there and partners, that can work together. But basically, as you're going through the process, have a way of, as you build those protections in, when you get to the app and the app is out in the wild, detecting these new threats, and then remediating, auto-remediating it, right? So that you can continuously be changing with the environment for your user as they go on. So I just want to thank you very much. Sorry, I had a lot of stories to share. If you have any questions, I know we're just 1 minute over. Please, send me an email or message me. And my information, I think, is in the app. But also, this is lunch now, so I don't want to stop you from having lunch. But if you want to meet for lunch or whatever, let me know. So thank you very much.